Chapter 3. Democratization of Australia's Foreign Policy. New political levers. Until the last few years, sophisticated foreign policy debates have been reserved of parliamentarians, cloistered policy wonks, and retired diplomats. Absent major wars, foreign policy has seldom been a topic of live national discourse, let alone a subject that significantly impacts Australian elections. Initially, the mission of Australia's few international affairs institutes was to elevate foreign policy issues in the national consciousness, giving public visibility to Australia's global interests and concerns. Think tanks used online innovations such as blogs and digitised surveys to canvass ideas and nurture debate. Academic institutions and associations created new courses and programs to attract young talent, while international scholarships, partner programs, and endowments promoted volunteering, career pathways, and bilateral people-to-people exchanges. These organisations have met only partial success. They are effective at identifying and developing new talent. But other than supplying talking heads for Australia's media programs, public-facing organisations have made only modest headway in making foreign policy a popular concern. However, former voter apathy towards foreign policy is undergoing a transformational shift across the entire Western world. The rise of long-form podcasts and social media is rapidly expanding the national foreign policy constituency, with general audiences increasingly attracted to formats suited to in-depth discussion about complex challenges. In some dramatic cases, popular sentiment has shattered the monopoly held by traditional elites. The Brexit referendum saw ordinary British people vote to leave the European Union and then see off a concerted campaign to overturn it. Donald Trump eviscerated Republican Party dogma on the Iraq War, and then the Democrats on liberal interventionism as well, to become president of the United States despite never having run for office. So he came along as an outsider, wiped the foreign policy elite completely. In fact, there was a signed letter from a bunch of Republicans led by Elliot Cohen trying to basically denounce Trump when he was running in the Republican primaries. And I published a sharp rebuke to that letter, saying that Trump was actually right on a lot of things and this wasn't their place. A lot of those people are left red-faced and embarrassed now because they signed a letter that essentially was a death warrant to being part of the new administration. So a real regret all around. In these instances, and many others, social media tools and the influence and popularity of independent content creators was instrumental in tearing down long-held barriers and popularizing foreign policy decision-making. There is no going back. 19th century romance ideas of high international diplomacy being played out by geriatric statesmen pointing at gargantuan maps has long passed. Civil society has burst onto the scene, with newly formed organisations and outside individuals having a dramatically increasing influence, as we seek to do. Indeed, our own channel has existed for only 3 months, and yet analytics indicate the beginnings of exponential growth in terms of subscribers, views, and watch hours. So, still early days, we're only 3 months in, and yet we've had just so far 12,000 independent viewers. So we've reached at least 12,000 people since we started. So that's great. This is by no means abnormal, mirrored by many other more established platforms reaching audiences and exerting influence. The consequence is that for many politicians and their local constituents, foreign relations increasingly resembles other shared interests of state and federal responsibility, such as health, education, jobs, transport, and taxation. So when you watch the news You see a lot of debates about all of these issues, a lot of toing and froing between the states and the federal government on areas of responsibility, because voters care about that. Well, voters are increasingly care about Australia's strategic foreign policy global direction. So Chapter 4, Lobbying versus Dialogue, a new national division. Unfortunately, Australia's foreign policy influencers behave more like lobbyists than forums facilitating analysis and deliberation. Many are listed on the Foreign Influence Transparency Register. Entities and individuals regularly appear in the media strenuously advocating foreign policy positions and actions while publicly denouncing alternative perspectives and their proponents. This has created a hostile, winner-take-all jungle in Australia's foreign policy influence. Cohesion in grand strategy depends entirely on individual factions maintaining political ascendancy in perpetuity. Take Australia's policy towards China and the US alliance, for example. Various foreign-supported think tanks, research institutes, and academics that operate in Australia consistently advocate an aggressive and assertive containment for China, with initiatives such as the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, expansion of American strategic presence on Australian soil, curtailing of Chinese foreign investment and movements towards in Australia, and movements towards collective defence arrangements in Asia. So basically Australia signing up for a global containment strategy with the United States against China. Conversely, Australia's corporate bodies, education institutions, and business leaders stress restraint when it comes to antagonising China. They argue that Australia should visibly exclude itself from any disputes between China and its neighbours or the United States, and avoid taking any action that could jeopardise bilateral trade or the broader economic relationship. So, our significant trade relationship and our critical strategic partnership, and those things are in tension, as I laid out before. Australia's dealings with the Chinese Communist Party has proved naive. Preserving sovereignty and liberal democracy must be paramount, lest our dependency on China grow such that we irreparably compromise both. However, too often, those on the other side of the debate have their reputations impugned or patriotism unfairly called into question. Conversely, pro-China advocates have at times sought to paint those raising awareness of CCP aggression and human rights abuses as stooges for the United States or even neoconservative warmongers. To a large extent, the perceived need for an Australian Foreign Relations Bill is derived from this deepening national division. Simply legislating a veto power will do little to hold back the tide. For the legislation to prove effective, it must be paired with new mechanisms for dialogue between different actors to rebuild Australia's strategic accord. In this regard, government, both federal and state working together, has a critical role to play. And then finally on the Australian Foreign Relations Bill, final chapter, the role of state and territory governments. It was clearly inappropriate for the government of Victoria to sign up to the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative, absent Australian government endorsement. This displayed as little to help the people of Victoria and much to embarrass the nation on the world stage. Other examples are even more preposterous, such as in 2011, when Sydney's Marrickville City Council, this is a local government council, instituted a boycott of Israeli goods within that administrative area. I think they were sued and were forced to pay a significant sum too. Local governments have no claim to be involved in foreign policy. The Minister for Foreign Affairs should have absolute remit to disallow agreements between local government entities and foreign powers, and is fully entitled to question such negotiations in the first instance. I mean, these people are there to collect rates, put out the garbage. They have no business talking about foreign policy. State and territory governments are not in this same category, however. Australia's foreign relations are a huge influence on each jurisdiction's prosperity, community cohesion, and service provision. State premiers and relevant ministers are critical stakeholders in Australia's foreign policy, both in development and delivery. While primacy of the federal minister is both necessary and desirable, absent broader changes to how foreign policy is formed and administered, the proposed legislation will not achieve its intended outcomes. Instead, state premiers, so the leaders of the states, like a US governor, for example, state premiers will find workarounds to maintain overseas partnerships. Arguments will arise over what is foreign policy for the purposes of the legislation. The minister's power will be routinely disputed and frequent legal actions brought at taxpayer expense. Taken as is, the proposed Australian Foreign Relations Bill will create a new front for different levels of government to capitalise politically by exploiting current and worsening differences in its foreign policy disputes. And just as with international borders during the COVID-19 pandemic, the law itself will be subservient to, not master of, regional political realities. So what that means is, in Australia, we have in the Constitution, you cannot have intrastate borders that prevent people from crossing from one state to another. And yet, state governments across Australia have put up state borders and prevented the free movement of people, which is arguably, and it's up for discussion, there's people on both sides here, I wouldn't propose to take a side, but arguably is unconstitutional. So what that would mean is, so basically, just block out this bit. Actually, wind it back a bit. So what this means is that in Australia, there is an argument that you can't have state borders that prevent people from crossing across state lines. However, because of the disease and quarantine measures, state premiers have put up hard borders in various cases, and there's a giant question mark, which the High Court will decide over the legality of those barriers, right? But what we can say is that the law is kind of beside the point. What put up those barriers were the political imperatives and arguably the health imperatives. And just as with that, whatever the law says about the Minister for Foreign Affairs having veto power over arrangements and things like that, if there is a strong constituency within a state that wants something to happen and it's in the Premier's interest that it does happen, well, they're going to find workarounds around the legislation. That's kind of what I'm saying. To ensure that the Australian Foreign Relations Bill helps to restore national cohesion in Australia's foreign policy, it is necessary that the state premiers be enfranchised as well as deferential. While the Minister for Foreign Affairs should wield ultimate veto power over arrangements between subnational governments and foreign entities, foreign policy should likewise become a standing concern for national cabinet, wherein state perspectives can probably be represented and included in federal decision-making. So national cabinet being where the federal government and the states sit down together and discuss issues of shared interest, to include foreign policy as a standing item so they can all express their view. For Australia, the 21st century promises to be the most challenging for foreign policy stewardship by far. To navigate successfully, it is not enough for state premiers to be subordinated. Rather, they must be meaningful custodians, bridging differences where they exist, and an alliance with the Australian government pursues shared foreign policy objectives in a sustained and forward-thinking way. Conclusion. Dangerous policy thanks to the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for this opportunity to contribute a submission to Australia's Foreign Relations Bill inquiry. In principle, there is nothing wrong with passing supporting legislation that provides clarity to an existing constitutional prerogative. However, it is critical that the government recognise that what has caused such legislation to appear necessary are frictions in Australia's geopolitical landscape and its I'll start with conclusion again. Conclusion. Dangerous Policy thanks the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for this opportunity to contribute a submission to Australia's Foreign Relations Bill inquiry. In principle, there is nothing wrong with passing supporting legislation that provides clarity to an existing constitutional prerogative. However, it is critical that the government recognise that what has caused such legislation to appear necessary are frictions in Australia's geopolitical landscape and domestic constituency that will only intensify. Therefore, as part of this legislation, the government should create new mechanisms that include state and territory jurisdictions in Australia's foreign policy formulation and decision-making, in addition to asserting federal primacy. This approach recognises and responds to the enormous complexity of the global environment and the increasing popular influence on Australia's foreign policy direction. At the end of the day, the Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs are accountable for a unified foreign policy, but state premier buy-in is essential for making any such foreign policy a success. So that's our submission, and I'll keep everyone informed as to the hearing. So the next stage is that there'll be hearings. Probably it'll happen digitally because normally you go to Parliament and you testify in person, but of course the situation is a little different in 2020. The committee members will decide who they want to speak to, and they will summon those individuals. So if we get summoned, I will definitely let you know and give everyone an opportunity to perhaps even watch live the testimony that I give. The basic premise here, though, is that we need to, we have a very tense domestic struggle when it comes to foreign policy. There are those that are staunchly anti-China, pro-liberal democracy, pro-Western ideals of Enlightenment tradition, empiricism, and freedom of the individual, freedom of expression, free markets, etc. And I would put myself firmly in that category. But I recognise that there is an argument on the other side, and it's a non-trivial argument. I mean, over 30% of Australia's exports, perhaps even more, goes to one country, China, and we are an export country. So it's our two-way trade relationship is China way up the top in terms of our important trading partners. And so all across the Australian economy, the intertwined nature of our relationship is highly dependent on Chinese success. So I think we need to untangle some of that, diversify. We need to do that as a priority, but we won't be able to do it if state premiers don't agree. And no amount of veto power from the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Yeah, it may help politically deal with some, with American interlocutors and so on. It's not going to actually achieve the outcome, though. So the best way to solve this is to bring premiers into the tent, bring them on to the National Cabinet, discuss foreign policy there, make sure all their views are heard and the federal government's views are heard, and to come to an accord as to how this relationship and our foreign policy strategy overall will be managed. I also recommend that we create a new co-funded think tank between the states and territories that actually actively seeks out the different groups, civil society, the podcast, the business leaders, all of that stuff, to give a full picture of what it looks like out there so that we can bridge these differences. Because if someone is absolutely pro-China, I don't question their loyalty to Australia. I think that it's entirely possible to have we love China view without being unpatriotic to Australia. It's entirely possible to think that is in the best interest of the country, and some very prominent people do. And they have an argument to make, and we have an argument to make to say, look, yes, it's extraordinarily expensive what we suggest. There are risks, there are pitfalls, but there's also the long-term risk of doing nothing. And that's my attitude towards China. That's also my attitude towards North Korea. So we need to have these systems in place, and this is a good opportunity to do it. So anyway, that's our submission. If you found value in understanding how this sort of workings of government operates in practice and how you can sort of start to see how dangerous policy is trying to have an influence, please do like and subscribe. Liking and subscribing really shows the YouTube algorithm that people value the content, that they're getting value out of the content and they want to see more. So please do that. Leave a comment down below as to where you see things in terms of Australia's China relationship, in terms of the popularization and democratization of foreign policy generally, where outside actors, non-elites can come in and have a big influence. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Thank you.